welcome. It's so nice to see you here at the Church History Symposium. My name's Casey Paul Griffiths. I'm a professor of church history and doctrine here at BYU. I should say assistant professor. There's a difference. And we're glad to have you here for our very last session. We have two wonderful presenters that we're excited to hear from, Bradley Armstrong and Kent Larson. And so we've already had an opening prayer to start the symposium. We'll start with our first presenter. Let me give him a brief introduction. Bradley Armstrong grew up in Logan, Utah. He served a mission to Iowa. He graduated from USU with a degree in history, and he's been active in community organizations and events, and he is currently serving as the president-elect of the Cache Valley Historical Society. It is okay to clap. Let's give some warm applause to Bradley Armstrong.
B.H. Roberts, it could be suggested, was an enigma within politics during the 1890s. He was surrounded by political controversy throughout his adult life. The challenge he faced was separating his yearning for politics from his ecclesiastical responsibilities. Roberts' political ideology frequently opposed the mainstream political views of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He supported religious freedom and would write about and speak on the official position and policy of the church regarding the separation of church and state whenever the issue needed to be addressed. He would take great care in reinforcing the church's position after Utah was granted statehood in 1896. The central theme for this paper is a position B.H. Roberts took on church-state relations, which he expressed during a banquet shortly after the Utah Constitutional Convention in 1895. He was asked to address the audience on church-state relations. This had been a divisive issue, especially between the territory of Utah and the United States. The crux of his speech was centered on this hypothesis, which he declared, quote, there are three relations which the church and the state may sustain to each other. First, the state may dominate the church. Second, the church may dominate the state. And third, church and state may occupy separate spheres and be absolutely divorced the one from the other, close quote. My goal for this paper is to expand on Roberts' hypothesis using various examples of Mormon history during the 19th century. There are defined times in which we might apply the construct of Roberts' hypothesis to the development of the territory of Utah and how the Mormon Church evolved from settling the territory to the granting of statehood in 1896. I will share some of the measures the United States government took in an attempt to forcibly stop the rise of Mormonism and the freedoms they desired. I will briefly discuss the background and positions of Utah and the leadership in the Mormon Church and how B.H. Roberts fit into the narrative. And I will conclude with a brief summary of the status of church-state relations in the United States during the 19th century. The church and its leaders had been continually persecuted for religious beliefs since its founding in 1830. After the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith in 1844, the saints moved west in 1847 in hopes of finding some semblance of safety and peace from their detractors. The church had some quiet years in the Utah Territory until the early 1850s. The latter half of the 19th century, however, vaulted Mormonism onto the national stage in an unintentional yet profoundly negative light. The federal government constantly pursued the church through political, economic, and legal persecution during the latter half of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The Manifesto of 1890, delivered by President Wilford Woodruff, temporarily appeased the government. Even after statehood, the church and its members continued to be persecuted to some degree. The persecution was carried out to great extent by every avenue the federal government had within its power. The persecution was enhanced by mob violence, which played a role in various areas of the country. There are many examples during the 19th century of what lengths the government would seek to stop the progress of the church. One example is the Utah War of 1857 and 1858, also known as Buchanan's Blunder. This incident exemplified the persecution led by a false narrative of sedition and treason against the United States. From 1852 to 1890, the persecution was driven in large part by Orson Pratt's declaration in 1852 on behalf of the First Presidency that polygamy would become the standard practice as revealed by Revelation. Orson Pratt would become the church's mouthpiece for the practice of polygamy. The other form of persecution was very political in nature. Shortly after the Republican Party was founded in 1854, anti-Mormonism became a foundational crusade for the fledgling Republican Party, which associated polygamy with slavery. The 1856 platform of the Republican Party resolved that, quote, "It is both the right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery," close quote. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862 was the first of several congressional acts that were introduced between 1856 and 1890. It was initially brought before Congress before the Civil War, and though it was tabled, would end up becoming law in 1862. It outlawed bigamy and overturned the incorporation of the Mormon Church in Utah. There were several other congressional acts between 1860 and 1870 that were never passed, but the issue of Mormons and their practice of polygamy, commonly referred to as the Mormon question, was at the forefront in Congress and the Supreme Court. One example of the bill being tabled was the Wade Bill of 1866, introduced by Senator Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio. This bill was focused on placing all federal activity under the direct control of the governor and stripping the Mormon Church of its temporal authority. It was never passed, but opened the door for future legislation that would become law. The Poland Act of 1874 was the next key congressional act to pass. It curtailed the jurisdiction of the probate courts and changed the method by which juries were selected to facilitate convictions under the Moral Act. This bill became front and center as polygamy began to be prosecuted in the courts. A significant feature of the clearly Republican measure was language expediting the appeal of convictions for polygamy to the U.S. Supreme Court. George S. Reynolds was prosecuted as a test case, and the Supreme Court moved the anti-polygamy campaign into a new phase by sustaining the constitutionality of the 1862 law. The presidency of Chester A. Arthur between December 1881 and August 1882 witnessed the introduction of no less than 23 bills and constitutional amendments on polygamy, along with other proposals and stacks of petitions on the Mormon question. There were two important legislative acts that profoundly affected the church in the 1880s. The Edmunds Act of 1882, which declared polygamy a felony in federal territories, and the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which restricted some of the practices of the Mormon Church. It also disincorporated the church and the Perpetual Immigrating Fund Company. Some of the other provisions included requiring civil marriage licenses and anti-polygamy oath for voters, jurors, and all civil officers. The federal government did all they could to maintain control of the territory of Utah. The time between the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 and the granting of statehood in 1896 could be suggested as a time when the church fell within a greater purview of the state, elaborated by B.H. Roberts' first point in his address. Quote, "Those who argue for the rightfulness of the first relationship will tell you that the state is not within the church, but the church is within the state. They will tell you that it is the state which rules the land, that wages war, that levies taxes, and governs at least the external destinies of that citizen, and that whenever the religious creeds cease to be individual and result in associations, those organizations come within the proper cognizance and authority of the state, and that the state has a right to draw the limits of ecclesiastical policy and to fix the constitution of the church as knowing what is best for the general society," close quote. Looking back at the early political conditions in the territory of Utah from the 1850s through the 1880s, the territory was analogous to a theocratic government. Roberts addressed with this his second point when he stated, "Those who argue for the second relationship, that the church should dictate the state, argue that the church, as a representative of the divine authority, is also the superior authority. That indeed the state itself is but an outgrowth of that superior authority, that as the moon but reflects the light of the sun, so the state borrows whatsoever of authority it possesses from the spiritual authority, the church. Furthermore, they insist that in the matter of chronological order itself, the church antedates the state. It is the first society, primitive and eternal, and hence has a true sovereignty, that the state is properly but the instrument of the church to execute the given decrees," close quote. The implication that the church came to dominate the territory without any voice from the Gentile citizens residing therein was a pressing concern. The congressional acts did provide the means for some non-members to be put into positions of territorial authority, including the governor. They were generally outnumbered and found it difficult to successfully fulfill their duties when members of the church would have the ear of the people. The Political Manifesto in 1895, issued by the First Presidency, in part states, "The President of the Church, Brigham Young, held for 8 years the highest office in the community, having been appointed by the national administration governor of the territory. The first secretary of the territory was a prominent official. An apostle represented the territory in Congress for 10 years as a delegate. The members of the legislature also held office in the church. This was unavoidable, for the most suitable men were elected by the vote of the people, and as we have stated, every reputable man in the entire community held some church position, the most energetic and capable of holding leading positions," close quote. Politics within the territory began to change once the railroad moved through Utah and became a primary means for migrating west. There were many Gentiles or non-members of the church that sought land, freedom, and in some cases, a change in political, economic, or social status. The creation of political parties soon followed as more Gentiles settled in Utah. The members of the church were known as the People's Party, and the non-members were known as the Liberal Party. And this lasted until the early 1890s as Utah prepared to become a state. The territory of Utah recognized the official Republican and Democratic parties of the United States as part of their desire to gain statehood. The process of statehood was very complex. The federal government required more from the territory of Utah than other territories because of polygamy. The church and the federal government would continue to challenge each other even after statehood was granted in 1896. Robert's third point was manifest during this time as the politics of Utah were becoming more defined in order to conform to the national political arena. He stated, quote, "Those who contend that the church and state should exist separately recognize the great truth that the church and the state have independent and different spheres. There is no proper connection between the two, and no necessity exists for interference one with the other. They contend that the church should exist unnoticed by the state, that religious creeds should approximate or separate them according to the inclinations of the church members," close quote. Although the church still held a persuasive influence in all political matters entering the 20th century, the church recognized religious liberties for the citizens of Utah, both members and non-members alike. Once Utah was granted statehood, the church continued to maintain the separation between itself and the state. Any remnants of the church-state unity that was prominent between 1852 and the 1880s were disappearing as more Gentiles would seek public office throughout Utah. There were members of the church who would still seek after and hold political offices, but the era of church authority in the political arena was over. B.H. Roberts' political background began in the 1880s at an early age. He was also a member of the presidency of the 70 and served missions to Tennessee and England between 1882 and 1887. He had many ecclesiastical responsibilities beyond his desired political extracurricular activities. He found politics to be intriguing and soon endeavored to become a political force for the territory and state of Utah. He was a staunch Democrat, and along with Moses Thatcher, was frequently at odds with the leadership of the church. They both ran for political office in 1894, losing to their opponents while opposing the wishes of the first presidency to maintain political harmony amongst the brethren. The attempt to keep politics separate from ecclesiastical matters was often challenging, considering there was a split of political parties among the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. There was a great deal of work necessary to become a state, and there needed to be unity amongst all the brethren. Roberts, however, continued to speak at engagements and never wavered in his political beliefs. He would tout the virtues of the Democratic Party, much to the consternation of the first presidency. They had repeatedly chastised Roberts and Thatcher, who had political aims of his own, and pleaded with them to cease their political activities. The previously mentioned Political Manifesto of 1895 emphasized the importance of church leaders spending their time and energy on their ecclesiastical duties and to request permission from the first presidency in seeking political office. It was presented to the membership of the church along with a public rebuke given to two leaders during the General Conference of October 1895. Although their names were not mentioned, Roberts and Thatcher took it personally to mean them. Roberts and Thatcher refused to sign it. They were both relieved of many of their ecclesiastical duties. In time and through divine inspiration, Roberts eventually agreed to and signed it. Thatcher never signed it and was dismissed from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in 1896. Shortly after this incident, Roberts left for a mission to the eastern states, separating himself from politics and to strengthen his faith and testimony. He returned in early 1898, seeking permission to run for Congress. It was granted and he won the 1898 term, but was never seated due to his polygamous relations. After the congressional inquiry into seating Roberts as a representative of Utah, he went back to exerting his time and energy with the ecclesiastical responsibilities that were given him. The political ambitions he sought after for so long were repressed, and he began writing and speaking on religious subjects. The first presidency gave an address to the world during the annual conference of the church in April 1907. Roberts quoted sections of this address to the world and spoke of the religious mind of President Thomas Jefferson at an annual Jefferson dinner in late April 1907. He declared unequivocally the current position and standing of the church, stating, quote, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints holds to the doctrine of the separation of church and state, the non-interference of church authority in political matters, and the absolute freedom of the individual in the performance of his political duties. If at any time there has been conduct at variance with this doctrine, it has been in violation of the well-settled principles and policy of the church," close quote. He would also enumerate some specific points that supported the official statement of the church. The principles of the church, quote, "The principles of the church in respect of the matters here considered are becoming better understood both by officers and members of the church, and all are finding the right relationship each to the other, and to the doctrine and policy of the church respecting such matters. Once more we affirm the fact to be that from both principle and policy we favor 1. The absolute separation of church and state, 2. No domination of the state by the church, 3. No church interference with the functions of the state, no state interference with the functions of the church or the free exercise of religion. 4. The absolute freedom of the individual from the domination of ecclesiastical authorities in political affairs. And 5. The equality of all churches before the law. To the maintenance of these principles and policy, we pledge ourselves in good faith as a church. Should political parties make war upon the church or menace the civil, political, or religious rights of its members, such, against a policy of that kind, by any political party or set of men whatsoever, we assert the inherent right of self-preservation for the church and her right and duty to call upon all her children and upon all who love justice and desire the perpetuation of religious liberty to come to her aid, to stand with her until the danger shall have passed," close quote. B.H. Roberts would continue to write about and speak on a variety of political topics, including the separation of church and state, throughout the remainder of his life. He remained in the political arena, sometimes at the forefront and other times behind the scenes. The 19th century presents a rich paradox when one starts exploring church-state relations. For many years, the 19th century was a forgotten century for traditional and historical views of American church-state relations. It was viewed without much focus on many of the important decisions that came through Congress and the Supreme Court regarding the separation of church and state. Constitutional historians, however, have recently come to recognize that the 19th century was a crucible for religious identity that left an indelible imprint on the culture and its institutions, an identity that remains to this day. Religious historians have described the 19th century as a Protestant empire where Protestant and evangelical beliefs and values would dominate the nation's culture and institutions. It was also a time of great religious diversity. The First Amendment in part states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The freedom of religion, as stated in the First Amendment, has been under attack from all sides since the founding of the United States, with many legal and political battles that continue today in Congress and the Supreme Court. The 19th century brought the First Amendment to life for the church. They dealt with a government bent on preventing the church and the Utah Territory from ever expanding to what we know it as today. The church dealt with mob rule as it began to spread throughout the country and the world. Social, political, and economic uncertainties underlie many decisions that the church was forced to make as the people tried to live their gospel. B.H. Roberts lived the gospel and served faithfully throughout his life. He became a political force in ways he did not anticipate or envision. He's remembered as an orator, a politician, and a faithful member of the church. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Kent and Bradley for their great presentations. And now we're going to open things up for questions. We're going to invite our two presenters to come up and sit in these chairs right here while they answer questions. We have a microphone as well that the two of you can kind of hand back and forth to each other. So questions from our crowd. Yes, right over here. Thank you. I believe we had another question right here. Really quick, I'm going to repeat the question so our online audience can hear. Just what were some of the different views in the day that B.H. Roberts and church leaders may have differed on? Please go ahead, Bradley.
I actually presented on this more in depth at the Mormon History Association conference, so I'm trying to recollect some of that. I think it was just the views that John Henry Smith was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and he was the chairman of the Utah Constitutional Convention, and he was a staunch Republican, and that's kind of when the Republicans and the Democrats kind of began to split. But one of the big issues, I think, was B.H. Roberts for many years was against women's suffrage. And the majority of the church was for women's suffrage. They wanted the women to have the right to vote, but the B.H. Roberts being a Democrat, I think many in the Democratic Party were against women's right to vote and women's suffrage. There are other issues, but off the top of my head, I cannot remember a lot of the issues because that wasn't necessarily my focus, but I'd be glad to talk with you more a little bit about that after.
Yes. Was one of the issues with B.H. Roberts' evolution and the nature of Adam?
I honestly am not sure. I've not read very much about that issue with regards to it, but that's something that would be worth, expanding in a paper like this is more of those issues.